Today's shiur begins 5 lines from the bottom of Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph. Before we begin the actual Gemara, we take note of some of the markings that we see. You will see a diamond, and that's featured on the side under our mivneh, structural note. But before we do so, we note the double underlining. This is a marking that started in our previous shiur on Daf Tes Zayin, where we highlighted the expression of a Nazir that accepted his Nazirus v'hu b'veis hakvoros. Nazar v'hu b'veis hakvoros. This was the Mishnah that we saw in our previous shiur, a person who vowed to observe Nazirus while standing in a cemetery, a place of defilement to the dead. The diamond, as is explained on the side, which we read, She'elois be'inyan mi she'nozar v'hu b'veis hakvoros. This represents a series of questions. This diamond you'll see here, and another question on Omid Beis. A Nazir, while standing in a cemetery, he accepts upon himself Nazirus. Number 1, Ha'im bo'inon shihiyah l'malchus. Is there an expectation or a requirement that in order to administer the punishment of Malkos, is there an expectation of tarrying, of delaying in the cemetery? Now, this concept of tarrying you find in the context of someone who, while in the Beis Hamikdash, becomes Tomei. There is, of course, a prohibition for being in the Beis Hamikdash in a state of defilement. So if a person, let us say, entered the Beis Hamikdash while in a state of purity, and then is exposed, becomes Tomei, and he's warned to leave, he is not said to be in violation of the laws pertaining to defilement in the Beis Hamikdash unless he delays there a certain amount of time. Exactly how much time that is, that's beyond the purview of our particular sugya, but just recognize that the concept of shihiyah is a certain amount of time. It's a very short amount of time, but it's more than, we'll say, immediate. In other words, if someone is warned to leave the Beis Hamikdash after he's become Tomei while standing in the Beis Hamikdash, and he hesitates, let's say, for 2 seconds, and then leaves, he won't be in violation because he hasn't tarried there the amount of time that we call shihiyah. What is the law regarding someone who accepts Nazirus in the Beis HaKvoros and he's warned to leave? Is he considered in violation if he doesn't leave immediately but tarries there a bit? Do we say that he's not liable to the lashing punishment unless he remains there after the warning, this amount of time called Zman Shehiyah? A second issue concerns someone who accepted Nazirus while in a cemetery. Is he required to take the haircut that is characteristic of a standard Nazir who became Tomei on the 7th day of his purification? So a standard case of Nazir who became Tomei, he needs to take a haircut. There's hair removal. Is that the case with regard to a person whose initial acceptance of Nazirus was while in the Beis HaKvoros? He was in a state of defilement at the outset. Upon his completion of 7 days of purification, is he also required to take the haircut, the Nazir Tomei haircut? Or, as we said before, maybe that's limited to a case of someone who had been tahor when he started his Nazirus and only later became defiled. Then, possibly, only then, is the Nazir Tomei haircut requirement. So now, having introduced the Gemara, we continue in the Gemara text 5 lines from the bottom. Boy Rava, Nazar v'hu b'veis hakvoros. A person who vowed to become a Nazir while standing in a cemetery. Mahu. Boy shihiyah l'malkos olo. in order to be liable to the punishment of lashing, and of course the punishment of lashing comes about only if he is warned beforehand, you accepted Nazirus, you had better leave the cemetery, leave the place of defilement. In order to become subject to the Malchus penalty, is that so only if he tarries a few moments in the cemetery, or even if he tarries less than that amount of time, that Kedei Shia, if just for argument's sake you say Shia is 15 seconds, let us say that he leaves the cemetery after hearing the warning 7 seconds later, he starts moving out. Is he considered in violation even then, or not? He's not considered in violation vis-a-vis Malchus unless he remains after hearing the warning 15 seconds. The Gemara continues. Hey Chidami. What are the circumstances here? If it is such that they told him, Lo Sinzar, don't accept Nazirus, that was his warning. Lama li Shehia. Why is there any thought of delay to begin with? Nazir Tohar, my time alo boy Shehia, a person who is Tohar, who accepts, he vows to be a Nazir. And he is, let's say, about to enter a cemetery, and he's warned, don't go in. We don't have any thoughts of Shehia being a prerequisite for punishment there. To call Masri Bey. Reading that again. Nazir Torah, my time alo boy Shia, to call Masri Bey. Nazir Torah, before entering the cemetery, if he is told don't go in, there's no Shehia requirement. He's guilty immediately. Hachanami, so too here, a person who is warned while standing in the Beis HaKvaros, don't accept Nazirus. Why should there be any expectation for delay? So that is not the, let's say, the circumstance or the background behind our question. So what is the circumstance? We continue at the top of Omid Beis. Ela Kagoin Shenichnas B'Shida Teva Umigdal. A person had entered a cemetery, but in an enclosure. A Shida, Teva, Umigdal, different types of enclosures, boxes, chariots, carts, or what have you. That protects him from the Tumah. He's shielded from the Tumah if he enters in that fashion while contained within a Shida, Teva, or Migdal. So his entrance to the Beis HaKvaros was not under forbidden circumstances. Ubo chavero upora me'olov ma'aziva. And someone came along, and beyond the individual's control, he removed we'll say the separation between the individual and the cemetery and the grave. Before going any further, let's take a look at the Tosfos at the top. The initial entrance of the individual was to the place of defilement. He entered under permitted circumstances. Velo loki aknisa. He's not subject to malchus for the entrance. V'chimasrin bei sheyetze b'shida. And when we warned him to leave, pora alov hamaziva. The separation between the individual and the grave was removed. Misafkele dilma lo boy shihya. Maybe there isn't any shihya requirement. Al dilma lo shna. Or maybe we don't make a distinction. D'chol hecha di'ira tuma hasam boy shihya. That whenever Tumah sets in, we do require Shia before we can talk about Malchus. For further clarification, let's look at the Rashi at the top line. Kigon shenichnas B'shida tevel migdal beveis hakvoros shemafsik beino levein hatuma. He entered the cemetery while contained within this, we'll say, shielded environment. V'nozar be'oidoi b'shida, and while he was in that box, shielded from the tumah, he accepted nazirus shehu tahor. He is still undefiled. And then someone came along and removed, we'll say, the floor of the box, which was in effect above the grave being underneath this chariot. Shahoisa hashida me'al rosho, the shida, this box, was above the grave. So we have a pretty clear description of what happened here. You have someone who entered the cemetery shielded from the tumah, while in this shielded state accepted the Nazirus vow, and then the shield in effect was removed, and we're asking our question regarding shihiyah, the issue of delay. And now the Gemara continues breaking the question down into its two parts, two sides. Ki gemirin shihiyah, the Megillah means a tradition that we have concerning delay. Beveis Hamikdash aval avroi lo. It might be a tradition that applies to someone who becomes tamei while in the Beis Hamikdash, while in the Holy Temple. But outside the Holy Temple, like our case of a person who accepted the Nazirus while in a Beis Hakforos, shielded from the Tumah and then became exposed to the Tumah, there, unless he leaves immediately, he will be subject to Malchus. Meaning, if we said the Zman of Shihiyah, the length of time of Shihiyah is 15 seconds, if he tarries even a moment beyond immediate exit, he'll be guilty. Oy Dilma, lo shnor. Maybe we don't make any distinction between the Beis Hamikdash and this case, and as long as he exits before the 15 seconds lapses, he is not subject to Malchus. Teku. The question remains unresolved. Boy Ravashi, Nazar v'hu beveis hakvoros. A person accepted Nazirus while in the cemetery. Eventually, he's going to leave the cemetery. In our previous sugya from Daf Tez Zayin, we learned that according to both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, the Nazirus sets in. So, after 7 days, does he, in this particular case, require the hair removal, the giluach, the hair body shaving that's required of a Nazir who became Tomei? Here, we're not dealing with a Nazir who became Tomei. We're talking about a person who was Tomei, who was defiled when he accepted the Nazirus. So the question is asked. In the Gemara, Boy Ravashi, Nazir vu beveis hakvoros ton giluach oy loy. Does he require on his 7th day of purification, the 7 days after departure from Tumah, then we say there's a sprinkling of Pora Aduma water ash mixture on the 3rd day and the 7th day. There's an immersion in the mikveh, and the question here concerns the haircut that a Nazir Tomei ordinarily must take. What about in this case? And now again we break the question down into its two sides. Kiboy tiglachas. The idea or the requirement of a body shave is tohor shenitma. That's a case of someone who was a Nazir tohor who became Tomei, to come mitamel in Nazirusay. He defiled his pre-existing pure Nazirus. Avol Tomei shenazar lo. But someone who was already defiled before he accepted Nazirus, maybe the haircut, the hair shave requirement does not apply. Oy dilma lo shna, or maybe we make no distinction. As the Gemara goes on, a new geometric form is introduced, and you can see on the side of the Gemara we have the Nosei Mivneh heading, and take note of the fact that this continues till Yud Ches Omed Aleph, and we read on the side under our topic heading and structural note the trapezoid or volcano shape with the narrow part facing up, Nisyonos laharos de mishanozar bekever boi giluach liachar shinitar. These are attempts to show that one who accepted Nazirus while in a state of Tumah does require the shaving after he achieves Tahara. The inverted shape, Mokor Besofa Sugya, will be introduced a source at the end of this discussion, Shemelamed the low boy tiglachas. So those of you who are real marking enthusiasts and appreciate seeing the overview of the sugya before learning it. So here we have quite an exciting situation where the direction of the Gemara for the most part is an attempt to show that there is a haircut or hair shaving requirement. Of course, each one of these attempts is subsequently dismissed. But finally, the thrust of the Gemara is in the opposite direction, where a source is introduced showing that he does not require the tiglachas. And if you take a look on Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph at the end of the source that's quoted at the upper quarter of the page, you can see at the end there's a dashed underline where it says V'liftor es ha-Nazir bekever, to exempt the Nazir bekever case from the tiglachas. Now that the map has been laid out, the Gemara, Toshma, does the Nazir v'hu b'veis hakvoros require at the end of his 7 days of purification from tumas meis, from defilement to the dead, does he need the giluach? So the source says, Misha Nazar v'hu b'veis hakvoros, afilu hayasham shloishim yoim. Of course, a quote from our Mishnah, someone who accepted Nazirus while in a cemetery, even if he was there for 30 days, eino oilolo min haminyan, those days don't count toward his Nazirus requirement, v'eino mevi korban tuma, and he does not bring the sacrifice that ordinarily is required of a Nazir who became Tomei. And now we infer, Korban Tuma hu delo maisi, it is that he does not bring, this case, the case of the Nazar beveis hakvoros, avol giluchi boi, but the hair shaving requirement does apply. The Rashi across from here says, Korban Tuma hu delo maisi, mishum delo maisi korban elaman de metamele l'nezirusei. The only one who brings a sacrifice for defilement, because of defilement, is someone who ruined that which was a previously good Nazirus. In other words, in the midst of his in the midst of a proper pure Nazirus, he defiles himself. Then you bring a sacrifice. Avol giluach boi. But as far as the hair shaving is concerned, that's required of a person who leaves Tuma while a Nazir, that would be required here. The Gemara dismisses that and says that as far as the Mishnah is concerned, ma ta'am k'omar. The Mishnah is giving an explanation for its law. Ma ta'am eino mevi korban tuma. The Mishnah says that he does not bring a korban tuma. Well, why is that? Mishum delo boi geluchi. It's because he doesn't require the hair shaving. So that what we inferred from the source is not to be viewed as an inference, but rather as an explanation as to why he doesn't bring a korban tuma. Why not? Because this gentleman who was Nazar v'hu b'veis hakvoros doesn't require the shaving. Tol shma. And again we see a quote from a source that we saw in our previous shiur. Ein bein Tomei shenazar lenazir Torah shenitma. There is no distinction between a defiled individual accepted in that state, Nazirus, versus a proper Nazir who subsequently became Tomei. Elo Tomei shenazar shvi shelo ilolo min haminyan. With regard to a Tomei shenazar, when he counts his 7 days of purification, day 7 counts as day 1 toward his proper Nazirus. He doesn't bring a sacrifice, as we saw before. The Tomei Shenazar doesn't bring a sacrifice, so there's no need to have him wait till the next day in order to start his counting. So he starts his counting toward the proper Nazirus on day 7. The Nazir Torah Shenitma Ein Shvi Shelo Oila Loi Min Haminyan. a proper Nazir who became Tameh, the 7th day of purification doesn't count toward his new Nazirus. My lav, can we not infer, though, ha litiglacha zeh v'zeh shavin, regarding the issue of the shaving required after achieving purification, both would require it. In other words, both would require the shaving on their 7th day. Not only the Nazir shenitma, but also the Tomei shenozar. Loi, the Gemara rejects that and says, listen, this source stated the distinction between the two, and if you want to infer a point of similarity, so do as follows. Ha lemalkis zeh v'zeh shavin. However, with regard to lashing, both are the same meaning. After they're warned to escape, leave, exit the tumah, so they're both subject to lashings. Rashi points out that's in accordance with Rabbi Yochanan that we saw in the previous sugya. So with regard to that, they're the same. Avol, so we're now lead into a question. Avol tiglachas mai, but as far as the hair shaving requirement, are you going to say then zeh megaleach v'zeh eino megaleach? That the Nazir tohor shenitma shaves, is required to shave upon achieving tahara, and the Tomei Shenozar does not, then listen, this source should have stated that explicitly. The Gemara answers, Tana shvi'i shelo v'chol mili. The source contains that information by telling us about the laws of their respective 7th days. Let's take a look at Rashi. Across from here, Rashi Lisnei, and the Gemara answers, Tana shvi shelo v'chol mili. The v'chol mili tomei shenozar shvi shelo oila lo min aminyan. The tomei shenozar, his 7th day counts as day 1 toward his new Nazirus. Lefi she'eno mevi korban, because he's not required to bring the sacrifice of a Nazir Tomei. Umatameno mevi korban lefi she'eno ta'un giluach tuma b'shvi, because he doesn't require the hair shaving. V'zeh, the Nazir shenitma ein shvi shelo oila, his 7th day does not count. And why not? Because the fishiyesh lo legaleach b'shvi, he needs to take the haircut on the 7th day, ulahakriv korban b'shmini, and to offer the sacrifices required of a Nazir shenitma on the 8th day, ume'oisiyam shemakriv korban chalalov nazirus, and on the day that he brings his sacrifices, namely on that 8th day, then he starts his new counting. Kidurtiv v'chipur lov me'asher chota ala nefesh v'kidesh yisreish nizri b'yoyim hahu. The mashma, from that pasuk we conclude, from that day, from the 8th day, he restarts his counting. So, just to review the main point, this source that said that, the only distinction between the Tomei Shenozar and the Nazir Shenitma is the issue of their respective 7th days. Contained therein is this very point, that the Tomei Shenozar does not have a haircut, a hair shaving requirement. The Nazir Tohar Shenitma does have the hair shaving requirement. Toshma. So we continue, again, as we indicated before with our markings, and attempt to show that the Tomei Shenozar requires a haircut upon achieving tahara. Toshma. Ein li elo yemei tum'osoi she'ein oilin loy min aminyan. A Nazir who became Tameh, so there are days during which he is defiled. Those days of defilement do not count toward his new Nazirus, the Nazirus that he is required to complete. Yemei chaluto minayin. Let us say a person who was a Nazir and became a Mitzorah. And as such, during the Tzoras period, Tzoras is, for those who are not familiar, it's a parsha in the Torah that deals with defilement as a result of certain types of skin discoloration and other halachas. Within that parsha, there is the period of time during which he is chaluto, meaning he is a definite mitzorah. And during that time, he happens to be in a state of defilement. When in that state of defilement, if it happens in the midst of his Nazirus, we say that those days do not count toward his Nazirus requirement. So where do we know that from? V'dinhu. We can apply logic. Ma yemei tumasoi megaleach umevi korban. Just like a Nazir who became Tomei has to take a haircut and he brings a sacrifice, af yemei chaluto megaleach umevi korban. So too, we know that a Mitzorah, when he finishes his Tzoras period, he shaves he removes his hair through shaving and he brings a sacrifice. Uma yemei tum'asoi ein oilin loy min aminyan. And just like the days of a Nazir's defilement to the dead do not count toward his Nazirus counting, af yemei chaluto ein oilin loy min aminyan. So by way of comparison, we say the yemei chaluto also do not count towards his total Nazirus requirement. Lo, the Gemara, the source has a turnaround and says not so. The comparison is not true. Im amris bimei tumosoi, if you say that the Tomei days do not count toward his Nazirus, shekei mevatel bohen es hakoven. The Tomei days actually cancel all the previous days of his Nazirus counting. Lefikach ein oilin lo min aminyan. Therefore, they don't count towards his new Nazirus requirement. So that's as far as the Nazir who became Tomei. We say then with conviction that they're not going to count towards his new counting. After all, those very days of Tumah, his defilement is responsible for erasing any days that of proper Nazirus that he might have counted up till that point. Toimar bimei chaluto sheino mevatil es hakoidmen. Should you say the same thing with regard to the Tzoras period that does not cancel the previous days? If a person had been a Nazir and in the midst of his Nazirus he became a Mitzorah, we put those previous Nazir days on hold. We don't erase them from his counting. We put them on hold. And as a result, Tomar bimei chaluto she'eno mevatel es hakoidmen lefikach oilun lo min aminyan. Since the Tzoras days don't cancel the previous days, therefore there's room to think that the Tzoras days actually do count as part of his Nazirus counting. So which way to go? We have, as we saw in the source, a logic in one direction and then reverse that logic. Amris. So we answer, Uman Nazir bekever shesairoi roi l'tiglachas ein oilin lo min haminyan yemei chaluto she'ein roi l'tiglachas lo kol shekein she'ein oilin lo min haminyan. My love, is this not speaking in fact about tiglachas tumah? Before we offer a clear explanation, at this point we would be saying that the Nazir bekever, upon completing the 7 days of purification, he would require the hair shaving. The Gemara rejects this and says, Loi, tiglachas taro. The reference here to the Nazir bekever shesaira roi l'tiglachas is not a reference to the tiglachas, the hair shaving at the end of the tumah period, but rather it's a reference to the hair shaving at the final end of his Nazirus. Now, having given a skeletal explanation, let us focus on what was said toward the end of this source. In order to achieve further clarification, we glance at the Rashi commentary. Under the Gemara text, about halfway down the wide lines, my lav tiglachas detuma. The Nazir bekever, we said, Sairo roy letiglachas. And the Gemara says, is that not in fact tiglachas tuma? The kevon shehiza v'shana v'toval, this fellow who accepted Nazirus while in the cemetery, he leaves the cemetery, has the paraduma sprinkling on 3rd and 7th day, immerses in the mikveh, megalchanoso, he has a hair shaving. Ushma mino deton giluach. At this point, this is what we were trying to prove. In other words, we raised the question, is a Nazir bekever in requirement of a hair shaving or not? At this point, yes, sounds like he does. And now what Rashi does is he reads this information into the source. V'hochi mashma. This is how to understand the source at the Havamina level. Ma Nazir bekever shesairo roi litiglachas tumo lesof shiva ein oilin lo min haminyan. The Nazir bekever, his hair is designed or fit to be shaven at the end of the 7 days, and the Nazir bekever, those days of his tuma do not count toward his nazirus. Yemei chaluto she'ein sairo roy litiglachas tuma ela litiglachas tzoras. The nazir who became a metzora, his hair isn't fit for a nazirus tuma conclusion period. It's true that the nazir has a body shave, a hair removal at the end of the tzoras period, but that's called the tiglachas tzoras. So he's, we'll say, further removed from the realm of Nazirus. Lo kol shekain di'ain oila lo, all the more so. The Yemei Chaluto are not going to count toward the Nazirus. The Gemara then said, no, that's not what to conclude. When the source referred to the Nazir bekever, shesairo roy litiglachas, Rashi continues, lo, tiglachas detara, shim lo nichnas lekever, had the Nazir not gone to the cemetery. Hinami nichnas lekever v'nitar, or he went to the cemetery and became tahor. V'achakach hishlim yemei nizro, and then he completed his nazirus. Shehu ton giluach l'sof shloshim, after the 30 days of proper Nazirus observance, he takes the haircut. Dahachi mashma shesairo roi letiglachas tara. The case of a Nazir who became Tomei, eventually his hair is shaven at the conclusion of his proper Nazirus. She'ein megaleach tiglachas tuma ela tiglachas l'soif mairi. Avol b'mei chaluto eino megaleach tiglachas tara el tiglachas tzoras l'sof zayin. On a even, I think, clearer basis, we take a look at the Tosfos at the bottom, 3rd line from the bottom. My lav tiglachas detuma lo tiglachas detara. The source, when it spoke about the Nazir bekever as being saira roy tiglachas, it was a reference to the tiglachas of Tara at the eventual end of the Nazirus period. V'hachi ka'omar. Uman Nazir, and what the Tosfos is doing now is reading the source with this, we'll say, with this final understanding. V'hachi ka'omar uman Nazir bekever shesaira roy tiglachas. A person who accepted Nazirus while in a cemetery, the hair on his head is fit for tiglachas. The seir sholov, the hair upon him, is omeid lehiskaleach lechiyashlim nazirus detara. It is to be shaven when he completes his proper, pure nazirus. Sharei eino megaleach b'shvi, And here we have the main point. He is not going to take the haircut at the end of 7 days. So, mind you, the Nazir Bekever, Ein Oilin, the days of his Tumah don't count toward his Nazirus. Yamei Chaluto, the Nazir that became a Mitzera, Shein Saira Oimed Lehis Galech Lenazirus Tara, the hair on his head doesn't get shaven as a result of completing Nazirus Tara. He has a more immediate hair shaving need, namely the hair shaving required at the conclusion of the Tsaras period. So this Cholut is even, let's say, further removed from Nazirus in that sense. Lo kol shekain she'ein olin lo, then all the more so the days of Tsaras, the days of Chaluto, are not going to count toward his Nazirus. We continue. Hachi nami mistavra. This explanation is actually more likely. We continue at the top of Yud Ches. In other words, what the Gemara wants to say at this point is that the source we just read that spoke about the Nazir Bekever Shesaira Royos Galea Roy Tiglachas, that's a reference to the eventual hair shaving at the conclusion of Nazirus Tetara. The Gemara says at the top of Daf Yud Ches, Dei Salka Daitich Tiglachas Tumo. If you were to think that we're referring to the hair shaving characteristic of the end of a Tumah period, Yemei Chaluto Milo Boy Tiglachas, at the conclusion of the Tsaras period, is there not in fact a shaving requirement? And Tsaras is also a Tumah situation. So the source which contrasted the hair cutting by the Nazir Bekever, where it said the Nazir Bekever has Sar Sharoy Tiglachas, as opposed to the Cholut that doesn't have Sar Roy Tiglachas, it must be, like we said, that the Nazir Bekever Sar Roy Tiglachas is a reference to the Tiglachas at the end of the Tahara, the Nazirus B'Tahara. Because if it was a reference to Sairo at the end of the Tumah period, well, the Nazir, that is the Mitzora at the end of his Tsaras period, at the end of his Tumah period, also has a haircut requirement. There wouldn't be a point of contrast. No, that is not proof. Tiglachas de Nazirus Katani. In fact, the source might be talking about the Nazir Bekever having a hair shaving as a result of the conclusion of the Tumah period. So that if you want to prove it based on the Nazir, if you want to prove that the source was talking about a haircut at the end of the Nazirus Tetara from the fact that a Cholut also has a hair removal at the end of his Tumah period, and hence there would be no point of contrast otherwise, that's not convincing. In fact, both the Nazir Bekever and the case of the Yemei Chaluto are talking about haircuts, hair shavings at the end of the Tumah period. And still, there is room to contrast them. How? The Nazir Bekever is having a hair shaving that's Nazirus related. The Chalut, when he has his hair shaving done, that hair shaving is purely a Tsaras related hair shaving. And Tosfos points this out on the fourth line from the top. Lo, Tiglachas Tuma de Nazirus Kotoni. Klomar, Tosfos explains, the Oilom E Moloch Tiglachas de Tuma, that the Nazir Bekever and his hair that's royally Tiglachas is a reference to a hair shaving at the end of the Tumah, the 7-day Tumah period. Udukarmers, and you will ask, you say, well, then why does the source contrast the Nazir Bekever with the case of the Cholut? There still is contrast. And as Tosfos goes on to say, Lo, tiglachas de nazirus kotani. The Nazir bekever roi sairo le tiglachas machmas nazirus. The hair shaving there is a result of the nazirus. Uvimei chaluta lo boy tiglachas de tuma machmas nazirus. The hair shaving that a mitzvah is required to do at the end of his saras period, even though it appeared in the midst of a nazirus counting, that haircut, that hair shaving is ela machmat soraso. V'zeh ein shayach lenazirus klal. Hilkoch lo yalu lo yamav lenaziruso. Therefore, the case of the chalut, all the more so, is not going to be counted. Those days of tzaras are certainly not going to be counted toward the nazirus. We continue in the Gemara, second line from the top, at the end of the line, the inverted volcano shape. Tashma. The inverted shape, as we mentioned earlier, is introducing a source that in this case will show that the Nazir Bekever, at the end of his Tumah period, does not require a haircut. Up till this point, each time a source was cited, the thinking was that the Nazir Bekever does require a haircut at the end of his 7-day Tara period. Of course, as we saw each time, that attempt was rejected. And here, as we said in an opposite direction, Tashma, the Timei Roish Nizroi. The pasuk from Bamidbar Perek Vav pasuk test we have quoted on the side of our marked Gemaras, and the entire pasuk reads V'chiyamus Meisolov B'Pesa Pisoin. The Nazir who was suddenly exposed to Tumas Meis, to defilement of the dead, V'timei Roish Nizroi, V'gilach Roishe B'yom Torosoi, B'yom Hashvi Yigalchenu. The Torah says he, on the 7th day of purification from Tumas Meis, he has a shaving, a hair removal. We should point out, by the way, on the other side of the Gemara, under the Nosei heading in our marked Gemaras, we have it reads, Nazir Tor Shinitma, a proper Nazir who became Tomei. Number one, Yesh Lo Tiglachas. He has a hair shaving requirement at the end of the Tumah period. Number two, Vavoas Tziporin, and the requirement of bringing a pair of birds. One is an oilo and one is a chatas. Nazir Bekever, Kishinitar, the person who accepted Nazirus while in the cemetery, when he becomes Tahor, Ein Lo Tiglachas, no hair shaving requirement at the end of the Tumah period, and Eino Mevi Tzibar, and there is no korban brought. And now the Gemara. Tashma v'timei roish nizro. The pasuk that we read before, that speaks about a Nazir and Tumah, b'tor shenitma kosav medaber. This is talking about a proper Nazir who became a Tomei. Shehu ton havora seor vavora siporim. He requires the hair shaving at the end of the Tumah period and the bringing of birds, which is referenced in Bamidbar Perek Vav, Pasuk Yud. V'liftor, and exempts this. The pasuk exempts as hanozir bekever she'ein ton avor aser v'avor siporim. A person who, while in a state of defilement, accepted nazirus, when he eventually achieves tara after the 7 purification days, no hair shaving and no bird offering. V'halo dvorim kal v'chomer. In fact, logic would have led us in an opposite direction. A person was a proper Nazir who became Tomei. He requires hair shaving and bird offering. Someone who at the very outset was already defiled before accepting Nazir certainly should require the hair shaving and bird offering. Talmud Loimar, therefore the pasuk tells us v'timei roish nizroi b'mi shehoya tahor v'nitmo hakosu medaber. The language of the pasuk says he defiled his Nazirus. That indicates he was a proper, pure Nazir who then defiled himself. Someone like that, Sheiton Avor Aseov Avor Siporim, to liftar as HaNazir Bekever, and to exempt the case of someone who accepted Nazirus in a state of defilement, no haircut, no hair shaving at the end of the Tum'ah period. Shma Mina. This is conclusive. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.